Let's go!
Hang on a sec, chat. Let me actually bring up this article because this is very relevant to what happened yesterday regarding Resident Evil. This popped up over the past day or so. My apologies if this is going to blind your eyes, but it's important. So for anyone that's anyone, you might be familiar that I'm kind of a huge Resident Evil 4 fan. I put RE4 very highly in my regard as being one of the greatest video games of all time. And we've played it a lot on this channel. There was a notable concern after RE3 came out and a looming suspicion that the next game in the hands of this project developer was going to be Resident Evil 4 Remake. A little bit of history. Resident Evil 3 Remake was not completely made by internal developers at Capcom, the usual Resident Evil studios between the guys that make RE2 Remake and the main Resident Evil series. It was actually made by an outside developer named M2, in the similar way that the Resident Evil Resistance multiplayer thing that was added to Resident Evil 3 wasn't also made by internal Capcom devs. They were made by another external team called Neobards. So they were essentially outsourced in some way. Long story short, a lot of us were super concerned because at that point, it seemed that, oh crap, RE4 might have the same problems that Resident Evil 3 Remake had. And granted, RE3 Remake is not a super bad game. It has some very questionable decisions. I don't think it was a spectacular game by any means, but I think it definitely missed the mark in many ways that people were expecting it to hit. Now here's the problem. RE4 Remake is one of the most cherished video games of all time, and is one of the most ported games of all time. This game has shown up on so many systems, has shown up in so many different fashions, has been on so many different platforms. It's absolute insanity. Similar to Skyrim. Yeah, maybe I'd imagine Skyrim is probably got more. However, this is a much smaller game than Skyrim, right? Why is that, right? You might be asking yourself, why the hell does that kind of shit happen to a game? Because it keeps selling. People keep wanting a reason to play through RE4 on a variety of systems through a variety of generations, all the way back to the damn GameCube. And funny enough, this game's original history was only supposed to have a home on GameCube, and that was going to be it. That was actually a part of the exclusivity agreement for RE4 when it was first being made by Mikami, and it was supposed to only be on the GameCube. Well, money talks, and then it showed up on PS2, and now nobody has any noses. That leads us to today, right? Where RE4 Remake is not even confirmed. This is a game that isn't even supposed to exist, right? This is an article that should not even technically exist, but shit happens. And a lot of information was recently dumped from Capcom's internal information. And there is a very predictably an RE4 Remake scheduled in the future. Granted, this is all a grain of salt because all of this shit exists only because some stuff leaked a while ago, and everyone was already assuming, of course, they're gonna remake RE4. It's free money. So seeing it in the hands of the same devs that made RE3 was kind of worrying. Until now. Because it seems that Capcom's relationship with M2 after RE3 Remake and the sort of differences that they have is bringing the game back to internal Capcom development, and whatever the future of RE4 Remake is, whenever it comes out, because right now, people are like, we're gonna get an RE4 Remake trailer, this is gonna be sick. Everyone was saying this yesterday because RE4 elements are heavily inspired in Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 8. And I'm like, dude, no, this game is far away. And now, even within this article, it's saying that 2023 is when it's likely gonna come out. That was my initial prediction. 2023 is when I thought RE4 was going to come out before it was having development issues. So I think that is a very tentative time frame because this game is not going to be just some Resident Evil release, right? This is by and far one of the most celebrated and influential video games ever made. ever made. What I'm trying to say is Resident Evil 4 is Capcom's Final Fantasy VII. And how weird is it that seemingly the exact same situation as Final Fantasy VII Remake is happening again, where Capcom is noticing that the development of this game isn't really in line with the vision that they have for this title. We're gonna have to ring it back in. Who knows how long they've been working on. They've probably been working on RE4 Remake, right? These M2 devs have probably been working on RE4 Remake since they finished Resident Evil 3. But the exact same situation happened back in 2016, 2017, when Square Enix was like, okay, so this FF7 game is really important, and the stuff that we're seeing from CyberConnect 2 isn't really lining up with what we need it to be. So we're gonna have to take the game internally. Does it mean that everything is gonna be scrapped? Obviously not. But it means that clearly a completely new direction is going to have to be approached to a game that has this much reverence, right? This much fandom and community and history. Yes, ultimately it means that Capcom was not satisfied with the game and Square Enix was not satisfied with FF7. It is the exact same situation. It's this crazy that this is happening again for one of my top 5 games of all time. That's it. It's just blowing my mind that this is the situation. That's what's happening. So anyway, long story short, it's saying that M2's role was significantly reduced on an unannounced project. Mainline Studio Division, Capcom Division 1, which is the seemingly the Resident Evil 2 remake team, has been brought in to take a new direction. According to this, the RE4 remake had been in development since 2018. By M2. Little has been shared publicly about this studio, but people with knowledge of the company said it was partially funded by Capcom and compromised some former Platinum Games employees, including developers from Metal Gear Rising and Bayonetta 2 teams. Multiple sources indicated that following a key project review late last year, it was decided that M2's role in the game would be significantly reduced. Capcom Internal would be responsible for Resident Evil Devil May Cry games and now have been brought in as the lead developers of the RE4 project. And accordingly, there were disagreements between M2's reduced role involved and the studio's desire to stick faithfully to the template of the original RE4, partially influenced by the backlash of RE3 Remake. Here's what's crazy. RE3 Remake sold relatively well. Resident Evil 6 also sold relatively well. Capcom made money off of those games. Did they have backlash? They did. Here's where the Resident Evil team gets kind of a, hey, thanks, kind of acknowledgement from me, because these games still made money. They could have gone in the exact same direction from that point forward and just taken those things that made those games sell well and just kept going. However, they knew that a lot of people were not happy with the way RE3 came out. They really knew, regardless of fucking Resident Evil 6 selling like 7 to 8 million copies or something like that, that game definitely returned a lot of people that were at a boiling point with Resident Evil and how the action version of Resident Evil was when Resident Evil 6 came out. They could have kept going, but they didn't. They literally changed all of Resident Evil to go back to horror with Resident Evil 7. And now they are seemingly taking out the aspect that made RE3 Remake possibly not as good and taking RE4, which is a cherished game, back in-house. They don't need to do these things, but the fact that they are is, I think, very nice. I think this is all, considering what happened with FF7 Remake and how that game eventually ended up turning out, I think that's a very good call, because you're going to get the game back in the hands of the studio that knows how important this shit is, instead of essentially outsourced to some devs that are just trying to get the work done. So, Capcom's production team, however, is said to prefer a direction which would see RE4's remake inspired by the original, but with its own unique take on features, story elements, and environments not necessarily confined to the blueprint of the original, similar to RE2's use of Mr. X. And here's where it's like the chef's kiss kind of shit. RE2 Remake is a fantastic remake. It does not hold itself to every single specific standard that the original Resident Evil 2 does. There's a thing that you can do with making it too faithful. And by too faithful, it doesn't feel like a new game. Does RE4 feel like a game that still holds up to this day? This game is still fucking hilariously fun to play. Still has its moments of intense impact when you're getting swarmed by Ganados. Has a huge variety of elements and puzzles and areas and enemies. It still holds up. It is a genuinely greatest of all time kind of game, in my opinion. But when you play it, you absolutely feel that things can be updated. There are things that for sure feel dated in several elements of the game. Do I think that they need to stick to that stuff personally? I absolutely do not. I very much feel that RE4 is a game that can absolutely benefit from better control schemes, absolutely benefit from even more engaging enemies, even smarter enemies, even bigger crowds of zombies. One thing you have to take from what the impact of RE4 was when it came out was the fact that you weren't dealing with engagements of small zombies. You weren't dealing with engagements of 2 to 3 to maybe 4 or 5 enemies. You walked into a village and the whole village came after you. Put yourself 15 years later now, or damn, it's gonna be almost 20 years later when this thing eventually comes out, and we have next generation hardware at your disposal. Imagine how crazy engagements are gonna be in a possible Resident Evil 4 remake, where you have that many enemies running at your ass, and they're coordinating, and they're working with each other. And in the similar ways to Resident Evil 4, but in also new and creative and unique, crazy-ass ways that are gonna make it just as insanely exciting as it was before, but also like, oh my god, they're doing this. What do I even... That's the shit that gets me super excited about Resident Evil 4 Remake. Those are the things that made RE4 great, but now they're just amplified. And why do I think this is what's gonna happen? It's what they did with Resident Evil 2. It's literally their go-to when it comes to the internally developed Capcom games that make it great. The thing is, I think RE3 actually hit a lot of these points too that made me very happy, but the problem with RE3, as we know, this isn't made by the same people. The problem with RE3, there wasn't enough of it. Like the moments where the game was specifically Resident Evil-y, when you're in the town and you're solving things and you're going back to areas and you're revisiting an area and now new shit is taking place and you're solving this puzzle and you're like, maybe I can go back here, and you're doing the crit path and now Nemesis is chasing you down. You're like, holy shit, this is amazing. This is really good. And it lasts for about maybe an hour on your first playthrough. And then the rest of the game just becomes not nearly as engaging as the first portion of the game. So it's not like RE3 didn't have that part. It did. It's just that it should have been the whole game. Why did it have to? Why was the funnest part of the game at the very beginning and then that was about it? So anyway, sources were saying that RE4 Remake would now be partially rebooted under the new mandate, which could see its release delayed as much to the year of 2023. I think this is a very early prediction, right? If this took place at the end of last year, this is like 3 weeks ago almost. If this took place at the end of last year and RE4 Remake had switched developers, that's gonna leave them, if it comes out in 2023, potentially less than 2 years to get this entire game done. Even though there is some stuff done, that is not a long time. That is not enough time at all. I very much think and I hope that this game gets enough time in the oven to come out around 2024, but who knows? I think maybe early 2024, maybe February 2024 might make sense. And I'd prefer that, to be honest. I prefer that considering how much RE4 is celebrated, and especially considering that RE3 Remake did not include significant portions of the original PlayStation game to much of fans' disappointment. And I'm trying to think, like, what could you cut out of the original Resident Evil 4? Like, are you gonna cut out the extreme goofy elements? Some escort? Yeah, I think a lot of Ashley stuff definitely could change, right? A lot of Ashley elements definitely feel very dated by many, in many regards. And a lot of the quick time event stuff could absolutely be changed in some way to something more engaging and interesting. You know what? The number one thing I think is actually going to change is tone. I do not think that if this game gets remade by the same team that remade Resident Evil 2 at Capcom, I think the tone will be genuinely different. Is that a bad thing? I would 100% prefer Resident Evil 4's cheese, right? Resident Evil 4 has some cheesy shit in it. Your right hand comes off. Hey, it's that dog. There's some beautifully cheesy shit in RE4 that really is like a stamp on that game and when it came out and what kind of a game it is, you know? However, I am very much a remake approachist where I think things have a place in time, right? Resident Evil 4 still exists. It's being remade by fans, and it looks incredible even to this day. All that stuff is still wonderfully preserved in the original game. I think the remake kind of has to be its own thing. I think the remake getting a similar to approach that RE2 remake got is probably 100% gonna feel the same as an RE2 remake, where it has a lot of those things. The characters are much deeper. They go through a lot more stuff. It's much more dramatic, and it's shot well, it's acted well, you know? I truly think that's what's gonna happen to this game. What I'm trying to get at, are we gonna get a huge, giant, robotic stone Salazar statue crawling down a crumbling castle as you jump from a collapsing bridge to mash A to lift yourself up? I don't think so. I think this game, I think that doesn't really fit the tone of the game. There might be nods to it in some way. I actually think a lot of that stuff might go away, which isn't exactly a bad thing, but what it does is that it gives RE4 Remake a chance to be something unique and not exactly RE4 just all over again. Because what is the problem with that, chat? As we learned with friggin' FF7 Remake, what is the problem if you just set up the exact same sequences, if you just set up the exact same stuff that you know and remember? Developers hate it. Developers hate that shit. Developers hate the fact that they're just redoing the same shit that they did like 20 years ago, and they're just making it look better. The best remakes are the ones that update the game in some way, add new and engaging things that amplify what made the original so great. What was the first game that did that? Resident Evil Remake. RE1 Remake is so far and beyond, in every fucking way, so much better than the original Resident Evil 1, right? Because it amplifies things, it makes things scarier, it changes the atmosphere, it changes the way characters even control in many ways. To feel like that is such a great remake, the first one, really goes in that direction. So, all I'm saying is, I think RE4 Remake, when this game eventually does come out, is going to be a different game than the one that we remember. I'm pretty happy about all this, but this is far away, and this is a very early date. The kind of direction change is not uncommon with Capcom. People said in both RE2 and RE3 are said to have similar overhauls during their development. That is true. You have to realize Resident Evil 2 Remake went through several iterations of how the game was going to be. In fact, was a static camera angle game when it was first being developed, and the developers did not like it. This shit happens, especially when they know that these games are important and there's a big audience reaction to this kind of stuff. So anyway, this is exciting news. This is not bad news, but what it is a very much on the horizon type of thing. This is so far out right now. This is one of my favorite games of all time, much less an extremely highly regarded favorite game of all time, an influential game of all time for a lot of people. But this is extremely good news. All it means is that you're gonna have to wait more, but what it also means is that it's seemingly in the right hands now. I think one of the things that made me the most bummed out at the end of RE3 was just thinking that these guys are gonna be the ones that are making Resident Evil 4, and that bummed me out last year. I was like, oh, shit. But we're gonna be in the trenches for a while until this shit shows up. Let's hope RE8 is dope. Let's hope their crazy multiplayer thing is amazing. I hope it's amazing. Let's hope whatever the hell else comes out in between this time frame is going to be good. Yeah, I prefer not to go through another situation like RE3 again for a timeless fucking classic.